Welcome to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. And now, here's your host, Wade T. Lightheart.
Want awesome health? How about doubling your energy? With our free Awesome Health course, you can get a new video and lesson every single day for 84 straight days. The course covers everything from optimizing your digestion, nutrient intake, correct health issues, including weight, skin, energy, immune system, and so much more. The course could easily be worth $200 or $300 for, and yet it's 100% free when you go to bioptimizer.com. That's bioptimizers.com. Once you're there, just enter your name and email to get the first 3 phases of the Bioptimization report. You'll get the report immediately and begin getting your video lessons each and every day from there on in.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Wade T. Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another edition of the Awesome Health Podcast. And we're going to talk about kind of a rare topic that doesn't get the kind of light that it should. It's a condition called LPS. We'll break down what that is in just a moment. But basically, it's how this condition can silently drive fatigue, bloating, and brain fog. And we're going to get into some, discussions that are sometimes brushed over because of the uncomfortability of it, but it's really important when you're dealing with your health, you have those conversations. So like, for example, what your poop can tell you about your hormones, your brain, and your immune system. Red flags hiding in your daily routine, how to shift them naturally. Plus, we're going to talk about why healing starts in the soil and what that means for your plate. And today's guest is Martha Carlin, and she is a pioneering force in microbiome research. So basically, she talks about these microbes in your food, your gut, your garden, how they're all connected. And, after her husband, a little background on Martha, she'll expand on that, but after her husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2002, Martha taught herself chemistry, physics, microbiology, and genetics. It's a wide-ranging field. And the reason, the motivation was to understand the world of the microbiome, how whole body wellness is tied to a healthy gut. She founded the BioCollective, a microbiome research company with numerous scientific publications and patents under her belt. Martha's work is shaping the future of how we view health and disease prevention, and she joins us today from Kentucky to start unpacking, what's driving this epidemic, I think, I literally get hit up every day by people that are struggling with bloating, fatigue, and brain fog, and these type of things. And they try a lot of medications and stuff, but really they're not getting up to the source of why that originated in them. It's a combination of diets, genetics, lifestyle, and Martha's here to break things down. So maybe you want to give a little bit of a background, what, LPS is, and the motivation I admire to go off and be self-taught. I think a lot of the best practitioners in the field today are of that. There's a, motivation, a desire, a personal story, a personal connection, a personal reason, what motivates them to learn a bunch of different fields, because as you get into one, you start seeing there's cross correlations. And I think that's where the innovations in the holistic health field happen. They're not bound by one discipline or one particular category. And so what typically happens is a lot of the quote unquote trained professionals in the field, if you understand how that field is developed, you become increasingly smart at less than, I say an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less. And this is where, cross correlations between different fields can help. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today, Martha, to share with our listeners what they might be able to do.
Thanks. Well, so my relationship with understanding about endotoxin kind of goes back to poop. So when I founded the BioCollective, we were, I had become aware of the microbiome, the gut, and its connection to health, and had founded this company thinking, okay, we look at individual diseases, we categorize things, and then people specialize. But what I was seeing as I was teaching myself this was very early in the microbiome space, like 2015. There weren't a ton of, well-known experts in the field. And what I started to see was when I would go to conferences, there were common themes across diseases that were going on in the microbiome. And so through that process, I brought in to be my chief scientific officer, Dr. Raul Cano, who was a microbial ecologist from Cal Poly. He had been there for about 35 years, was a pioneer in like sequenced the first lactobacillus genome, was, really a pioneer in the way he thought. He was also a pioneer in using teams of bacteria to clean up oil spills. And so I started learning from him about the different kinds of bacteria. And on this parallel path, I was studying Parkinson's disease and looking for the first paper had been published connecting gut bacteria to Parkinson's disease. And so I was digging deeply into that and starting to make connections to different components of the cell walls of different species of bacteria that we found in Parkinson's fecal samples, basically. And so when you talk about bacteria, they have a membrane around them. And there's gram-negative bacteria, gram-positive bacteria, and then there's some that has to do with whether or not you can stain that membrane. But the gram-negative bacteria, actually, that cell wall is made of something called lipopolysaccharide, LPS, which is that endotoxin. So when those bacteria die off, you get pieces of that cellular debris. And then, if you're not eliminating properly, so you don't have good regular bowel movements, then you have more of that endotoxin waste sitting in your bowels. If you have a leaky gut, which I also started to see connections in endurance athletes, because endurance athletes, and my husband was a marathon runner, often have leaky gut after a long event that sort of opens up that gut. And we could talk about how that happens. But these endotoxins stimulate the immune system. But what happens over time, the more you're exposed to them, the less your immune system reacts. And so you get this buildup of this debris that your immune system is not recognizing and kicking out, but is causing this low-grade chronic inflammation wherever it has traveled, from the blood supply in your body. And that can be in the brain and things like Parkinson's, or, it can be in your joints. And so you can have, joint pain or arthritis. It can be just local to the gut, or, pretty much anywhere in the body. And I actually found a researcher in Parkinson's who was proposing a hypothesis that this LPS endotoxin could be a primary driver of the neuroinflammation in Parkinson's. And that was kind of an aha moment for me. I started digging a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole. And what you find if you go to PubMed and you start looking at endotoxin is almost every chronic disease has some kind of animal model or cellular model that is using this endotoxin or LPS to cause the symptoms of the disease. And that can be, diabetes or depression or just cellular inflammation models.
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand the inflammation in the aspect that inflammation is a natural healing response to an acute condition. However, if it continues on, and that's usually related to dietary elements that are contributing, that's repeat offenders. And so we evolve as people kind of go down their experiential journey. If they're not documenting when they have quote unquote flare-ups or increase of the symptoms, you can usually start to track those to certain dietary elements. And then eventually they start off as, well, I get this when I do this, or so I avoid that food or avoid that dinner. But again, at the end of the day, that's only a very low resolution, and you need to go a little bit deeper, especially if you've got that condition, because it's basically an overload of the inflammatory response chronically, and then that just keeps adding things onto it. Especially as we age, then our capacity to meet these demands starts to diminish over time, and then it becomes a snowball effect, and then usually at some point a disease emerges, and they associate a bunch of conditions in it, but there's a general sense and then an acute sense that leads to the designation of a disease. And for people who don't know, a disease is just a fancy way of usually putting a very long, complicated name that is daunting or confusing to the patient, which validates the doctor's response. And then it's surgery, or it's medication, or it's something like that. But all of those are essentially Band-Aid solutions. You may not treat the cause. And one of the things you mentioned earlier before we were on the podcast, you're on a farm. What's really interesting about people who have been in and around farm practice, I was myself as a young child, you start to learn about the elements of soil conditions, chemicals, how plants grow. And we consume these plants, of course, to get a lot of our nutrients. But then today, we have a whole plethora of what I would say non-plant-based foods, chemical additives, preservatives, dyes, flavor enhancers. The list goes on of the chemical agents that make food attractive, tasty, and addictive, I would say. And oftentimes, you understand the nature of an addiction, and the food science, as it's evolved since the 1970s, is primarily to create food that is more addictive. And generally, that food is not that good for you. And oftentimes, the person has to face actually an addiction to that which is disrupting what they're doing because they don't understand the whole mechanism. So people engage in fasting. And then the problem that emerges, especially as people are pretty toxic to begin with, and they start fasting, they often feel worse on the fast because, again, they have this plethora of die-off that you were talking about, which then further exacerbates the conditions. They're like, oh God, I can't do that because it seems to make things worse. And oftentimes things got to be worse to better. But I think you've probably worked out some of the mediations that you can do in regards to without the extreme aspects. So what have you discovered around this inflammatory condition, and how are you suggesting people, identify it, figure it out, and then of course get upstream of it?
Well, it's interesting because it's kind of tricky because, you can in a stool test, although a lot of the stool tests don't specifically speak to the endotoxin and LPS, but if you know what those producers are, you can look at a stool test and say, okay, I have a high LPS load. But the actual doing serum LPS in your blood, that's actually a difficult test to get. You can get it in the hospital generally if they're looking at you for possible sepsis, but it's not something that you can walk into LabCorp and say, I want a serum endotoxin test. We actually did a clinical trial with one of our products, and we ordered the endotoxin test from a German company so that we could do those tests to see if we were able to reduce that endotoxin. But when I started talking to a number of different health coaches about it, and they're like, well, where do we get this test? And I said, it's really not very easy to get. And it's kind of surprising when you start to look at how prevalent it is as a driver of inflammation and how connected inflammation is to all these chronic problems, that it's not an easily obtainable, test at LabCorp or Quest. I don't know if you have found, resources for that, but it's a bit tricky. And the test that they actually do is it comes from the horseshoe crab. It's called a limulus. It's LAL is the abbreviation. I can't think of it, but it actually triggers and indicates that the LPS is there. Now, on the microbiome side, in order to look at the more detailed stuff, we always do when we're doing sequencing either when we were sequencing our stool bank or, in our clinical trial work, we do whole genome sequencing. A lot of microbiome sequencing is just doing what's called the 16S, which is one section of one gene. But we would do the whole genome. And so then you can see all the components. So you can see, so endotoxin is one of the more toxic components of it is called lipid A. And so you can see in the genetic data of the gut microbiome from the stool sample, you can see how much lipid A is there and how much of the other components of that lipopolysaccharide are actually in the stool sample, and if it's improving with whatever you're doing to try to address the issue.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's a common occurrence. I have a lady who kind of manages a lot of our testing procedures. She's out in Sedona, Arizona, and she literally had, and not just in elements such as this, but it's a common occurrence in the holistic health field because you usually have to get a medical doctor in order to order the test. And if the doctor doesn't understand the problem, they're very restrictive and even just signing off on the test because they don't even know why you want this test or what's it for. And then you have the availability. And I know she's literally combs the world to find experts in the field or companies who provide various testing for elements that you just can't get easily. And that's where you really need a good quarterback in your team that understands this particular aspect. So I am not aware of where you would find one of these tests. So I'm glad that you've kind of solved that problem because, again, what you test or what you don't test determines the results that you're going to get. Because if you got something you're not testing for it, it's like there's millions of things in the universe that we don't know about because we don't have a test to validate or prove that they even exist, or we haven't even thought of what that might be. And of course, now with I think the internet, AI developments in order to get more information, we're able to source out some of these things a little bit easier. But again, having someone with a background such as yours is a key indicator because it's a key person, because otherwise you just don't even know that they exist. And your doctor says, well, we don't know anything about that or whatever, and you just got to kind of live with it. We can give you some anti-inflammatories, or we'll give you an antibiotic or something, and it's just like a one size fits all. Okay, I don't know that. See you later. I got to get on to my next patient.
Well, when we first started collecting stool samples in our bank, and our business model at that time was we were building this large bank. Each sample we took, we made into smaller samples, and we made those available to scientists around the world. And we were really a little too early to that part of the market. But, we started sequencing those samples and, looking for, what are the kind of markers and things that we would be looking for. And I mean, that whole process, when I started kind of digging deeply into sequencing, I thought, okay, you take a sample, you send it for sequencing, and what you get is the ground truth. And what I learned over the course of 10 years is that's not the ground truth. And so people ask me now, like, what's your favorite stool sampling kit? Because we don't do testing anymore. And I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. But, each test or each kit that is collecting a sample and has a preservative has a bias in the way it's collected, in preservative that it has. And then there's all these bias steps along the way in how it's processed, in the database that they use to look for the information to tell you what's there. And, different companies have proprietary databases. Some of them are using public databases. And so I actually found, sequencing my own sample, taking the same day, sending it to 3 other places, and all 4 of them having different information. So we actually have a publication on the biases of collection methods and all the different steps in the process. And then we have a second publication that we did with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where we prepared a set of fecal samples basically we blended them up and provided them to researchers all over the world, and they all sequenced them. And the samples were identical, but what we learned from that is how these different biases could shape what the results are. So that was a really interesting learning for me, is like, it's not a ground truth, but if you're going to use that as a tool, you should pick a particular kit and you should stick with it so that you're comparing apples to apples.
Yeah.
Jumping around from one kit to another. But the other thing I found, we started out in 2016 doing whole genome sequencing, and we would get a report that was 60 pages long.
Yeah.
And we would send it to people and they would take it into their doctor, and the doctor's eyes would cross, and, I don't want to, I'm not touching this. Sometimes I would have a curious doctor and they would call and I would talk to them, but they don't have most of them don't have the training to understand the complexity of the microbiome. But I even had a Parkinson's person whose sample showed the highest level of what's called proteobacteria, and there was quite a bit published on neurological problems and health issues with high levels of proteobacteria. And I knew her neurologist, and I tried to get her neurologist to refer her to an infectious disease neurology specialist, and he refused to see her. So, the complexity of this stuff, if you don't know what you're looking at, you have a discomfort level, doctors aren't trained. So, it's 10 years down the road since I founded a company to try to foster kind of a new horizon for that. And someone asked me last month, how long do you think it'll be before we really see this in clinical practice? And I said, I hate to say this, but it's probably at least another decade, because you've got to have a whole new kind of vision of how the internal ecosystem drives our health. And that's got to be foundationally taught in medical school. And it's nowhere near being taught in medical school yet.
Yeah. I think it'll change over time with all the rushing. And I did interview a lady that they are starting to look at some of these holistic elements at Stanford University with their medical doctors and expanding their awareness about what's possible. But you did bring up a really pertinent point, and it's been one of my pet peeves on stool testing. So thank you for that, because I've done a number of stool tests. The lady I work with, she's done, I don't know how many from different companies, and she'll order specific stool companies relative to those, what they're biasing for, because she's like, oh, that test is this stool thing. And that's a high level of sophistication that's not available to the general public. So I'm glad that you're filling that gap. So what are some of the things that you're doing in order from this research with clients that you have, that in order to mitigate these or eliminate these elements that are contributing to the problem? And maybe you can expand on the symptomology of this problem, because it's not an official disease designation, and that's part of the issue. Part of the issue is, well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's an opportunity too, because once you get an official designation of a disease, then you're in a really problematic situation, because now the standard protocol is, well, do this, here's your pharmaceutical rate. And if I heard you correctly, you're looking at a bunch of other options.
Well, so I'll use Parkinson's, because that, Parkinson's is, that's the passion that drove me into this. And even though my husband passed away from a pulmonary embolism, I've continued to try to solve this problem. And I actually have a publication coming out, I hope, before the end of the year, with Dr. Barry Ninham from Australia National University. And that's connecting, it's going through using the framework of something called the glycocalyx, which is that fuzzy layer that lines, all of our cells, all of our blood vessels, our gut, our blood brain, it's the fuzzy coat of everything. And it's kind of it's a universal nano infrastructure, kind of molecular sieve that is deciding what gets in and out. So when we talk about leaky gut, that's a problem there. But what we've done is take what is known about Parkinson's and the piece of the microbiome and what's going on there in the battle in the gut and what's going on with electrolytes and what's going on with the vasculature. And we can, through the lens of the glycocalyx and all of the kind of toxic burdens that we're exposed to that damage the glycocalyx, what we can start to do is demonstrate how this changes the propagation of electrical signal and what's going on and why it could be a lot of different factors that are contributing to a disease. And so through that, we're actually getting ready to start a small study, and I wouldn't call it a clinical trial because it's not a clinical trial. It's an open label, multiple. So it's more like an N of one. We have this protocol that we're going to try with 30 people. And if we get good results, because we've had a few people try it, we're going to carry it to the next step of potentially looking at it in a clinical trial. But it is taking a product that feeds the glycocalyx. So there's a product called Revasca. The glycocalyx is made of sulfated polymers and hyaluronic acid, which may explain why people who go on a nose to tail ketogenic diet, they get a much higher level of hyaluronic acid. So that may explain to some degree the benefits of that. And then it has these sulfated polymers that are the endothelial surface layer. And those are made of chondroitin sulfate, heparin sulfate, keratin sulfate. And those can all be fed by like seaweed. Because those are also sulfated polymers. But anyway, this product, Revasca, is we've had a few people with Parkinson's who have been taking that and seeing some positive results of like feeling more signal propagation, being able to kind of reduce their medications. And then I have a probiotic that I originally made for my husband, where we were able to see through testing his microbiome over 120 days that it was moving back toward a healthy human microbiome. We were dropping those endotoxin producers. We were restoring an anaerobic gut. So those two things kind of together is kind of a big piece of the foundational puzzle of fixing the gut and fixing the barrier, and then adding in humic and fulvic minerals, which, exposure to glyphosate in our environment, which is a minerals chelator. That means all of our food, all the way through the food chain, has less mineral density because, there's a chemical out there in widespread use that is binding up the minerals. And so adding back this, humic fulvic minerals, then being able to help propagate that signal. So that's something that actually we're going to be starting in January to see how that does. But one of the people who's trying it right now, kind of in advance of the study, has reported some pretty remarkable results in terms of increased energy, increased motivation, a lot of the kind of non-motor type symptoms that people like Parkinson's will often have: depression or apathy, lack of energy. And it's almost like they finally have enough energy to kind of be themselves again. So, we're very hopeful about that.
And now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip: turn cultured foods into superfoods. Raw fermented foods like sauerkraut and low sugar live yogurt can be good for you, but rarely have enough of the right probiotic strains for therapeutic benefit. So here's a way that you can turn them into superfoods. What I do is I get some raw sauerkraut or a healthy yogurt. Ideally, it's grass-fed or coconut-based, and you can empty 3 caps of P3OM into a container and mix it up thoroughly. Leave it at room temperature for a couple of hours before putting it back into the fridge. And what's going to happen is these probiotic levels will be multiplied. In fact, it doubles every 20 minutes. And then what you're going to get is you're going to have a food with strong proteolytic activity. To learn more about P3OM and why its patented strains make it the strongest probiotic available, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
So, for our listeners, because we used a lot of big, complicated words in kind of describing some of these elements, how do you go about if you've determined that someone runs some tests that they're suffering from this type of condition? What do you do about that for them and getting them to that more energetic, healthier phase?
Well, of course, being a gut person, I think the gut is really, a key source of that. It's interesting. Magnesium in Parkinson's is a big piece of the puzzle as well. There's often a lot of cramping and muscle problems there. And magnesium, obviously you have a magnesium product. It drives 300 different enzymes. So, if your enzyme function isn't working properly and you don't have minerals, we were looking at this before. Probably that's your product. I don't know because I have a photo background if that shows, but I love that because, it's got magnesium in a lot of different forms. So I think like looking at minerals in people, understanding if they're able to take up nutrition, because back to that gut barrier, if you don't have a healthy gut barrier and you don't have a healthy microbiome, what you're eating, you may not be accessing those nutrients. The microbes are stealing it from you, or you're unable to break it down into its components. I know you also have some digestive enzymes. In a lot of cases, we see that people are not producing enough stomach acid, or, they don't have enough ability to break the foods down into those amino acids in order to take up the nutrition. There's also some interesting evidence in Parkinson's in the oral microbiome. There's a research study that there's lower copy numbers from the bacteria in the mouth in amylase producing bacteria, so they're not able to break down the amylopectin or those components that require an amylase enzyme. They have less capability of doing that.
Yes, which is carbohydrate. It's for people know they've listened to us. Enzymes control everything from thinking to blinking. There's over 25,000 different enzymes. They classify from a digestive standpoint, I would say 4 main categories, which have sub-branches. So you have proteases, which break down protein, lipases, which break down lipids, cellulase, which breaks down cellulose or plant matter, and then you have amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates. And so one of the, I would say, remedies that a lot of people have dealt with in inflammation or in inflammatory conditions, they go to a ketogenic diet, which is now graduated in, its extreme levels to just a complete carnivore diet. I know the world-renowned Dr. Jordan Peterson and his daughter have a rare genetic condition where they have a massive inflammatory response, and they're basically on a full carnivore diet to mitigate the symptoms. However, that may be suboptimal over the long term. And, Peterson identifies that as, hey, I'm not recommending for this people. This is merely a mitigation strategy. But you touched on something else that was really powerful. I had another early expert in my training that turned us on to humic and fulvic acid. In fact, years ago, I read a book. Actually, it was a cassette, and then I read this book, and then I actually went to a lecture with him, Dr. Joel Wallach. And he was both a medical doctor and a veterinarian and grew up on a farm. And he said, well, what was interesting, he's seen all these diseases in the medical clinic they were treating with drugs and chemicals and stuff like. He goes, and you go to the farm and they're giving nutrients to the animals, and the animals are getting better outcomes than the people that were on the pharmaceutical. So his cassette, I'll never forget, it was called It was a cassette, so there you go. That's how long ago it was. It was called Dead Doctors Don't Lie. And so I got turned on to the whole humic fulvic acid element. So for those who don't know, humic fulvic acid is what plants use to break down inorganic minerals and convert them to organic minerals that can be uptaken by the body. And as I've outlined many, many times on our 5 stages of digestion as the key elements of your health, if you have a disruption in that process, it's not what you eat, it's what you digest, absorb, and utilize. And of course, the residues of that is where the toxins come in. And that's where these chemical agents that may be on your food don't fit within the calorie model. They don't fit in any food chart. They don't fit in, they're kind of ignored through the health industry, but these are the things that can be extremely disruptive. And then, of course, you mentioned leaky gut. When you start leaking food particles into the bloodstream, then you get a massive inflammatory response because your body's immune system says, "Oh, we got invaders." And so that you get a ramping up of that, which further catalyzes. So you get these triggering events, or you enter into a situation, a high mold situation, or you go off your diet and go to another country, you get exposed to new bacteria cultures that you're not normal diet. You get subjected to some kind of chemical adverse event, and all of a sudden, boom, you can't seem to come out of it. And of course, as people age over time and our systems degrade, you become more sensitive as opposed to less. And then, of course, you're literally starving your body of the key elements it needs to run. And then it's what they call the normal aging degenerative process. In a disease state, it's accelerated, but both of them have the same origins.
So I 100% what you're saying, kind of another back to the bigger picture piece of the puzzle. When we started looking at, okay, how can we help fix the gut? Because we see that as kind of a central hub. Raul, coming from this background of using microbes to clean up oil spills and all of that. And, we were sitting around talking, and I said, we can do all these things to put systems back in the gut with our probiotics and, help people figure out, what is affecting them, or get enzymes, or whatever the solution may be. But we're kind of just pushing a string up a hill if we don't fix things on a larger scale. And
Yep.
so out of that, Raul and I sat down and we ended up bringing in Don Huber. If you know who he is, he's one of the main glyphosate people. He was a professor of plant pathology at Purdue. But we put together a formula of microbes for the soil. So a team of microbes that break down glyphosate, liberate those minerals that are locked up in the soil, restore the respiration, so carbon sequestration, and increase the plant yield. And we have about 6 years worth of research on that, and we just got awarded a patent. But even that, with all that we have around that, it's very hard to gain traction in a world that is run by these big, corporate entities that control, agricultural distribution and the kind of boots on the ground with the farmers.
Yeah, I talk about this in many of my podcasts and literature that we've produced. And, we made a radical change in our food supply chain, post World War II, as everybody moved into the cities. And originally, farmers, crop rotated because you drive into different elements. You'd grow hemp, plow that into the soil to reconstitute the microbes in the soil, and you'd leave it fallow, what they said, for a year. And then you would cycle through the different vegetables to reconstitute the soil and get these microbes. When after World War II, we went to conventional farming to meet what they felt was going to be increased food demands. People weren't, I think it was over 90% of the people had some sort of garden outfit at their home. And then it went to like less than 2% of the world has that now, in certain North America. All of a sudden, these food, government mandated agricultural limits, big pharma, big agro were involved in this. And what they were doing is like, okay, we need to produce this much. So we went into these giant super farms. And then the plants started to weaken. And the plants weakened because they were literally starving. And so then they added things, like fertilizers and stuff, which increased the growth rate or the yield, but depleted of the nutrients. And then the immune systems of the plants started to break down. And now then they had to come up with all these other chemicals to kill the bugs or the pathogens that were on it. And so that added another toxic element. And then this stuff lies in the soil and builds up over time. And so soil degradation, chemical input, a non-reconstitution of the microbe. And then what we do in the farms ends up happening inside our bodies.
That for me, I did a talk back in 2019. There was a conference at Bard College called Reimagining Human Health. And one of the things I did as a promotion for that was just talking to people about, you think, oh, it's just a little bit out there. It's a little bit out here. Oh, I'm just spraying the little, the edges of my sidewalk. It's just this tiny, but it's not out there. It's not out there. Everything you do out there is in here.
Yes.
You are breathing it in. It is flowing in your water. It is coming at you through your food. It's everywhere. And I don't think people really understand that.
Well, and let's face it, we've moved significantly in the last 3 generations from how humans lived for a long period of time. And if you're born into an environment that never had any exposure to that, then you don't know what you don't know. This becomes the standard. And so if you polled a group of children, let's say right now, have they ever seen a carrot growing in the ground or a potato or cabbage in a field or anything like that? They have no idea. And if you take kids out to farms and they see this, they're blown away and excited, which was common exposure. I grew up in a very rural part of Canada. On my street, when as a child, we had ended up 3 centenarians. The last one just died recently. She was 106 years old. And one of the common elements is everybody on the street grew a garden. We had an amazing rich mineral water supply. Nobody was using chemicals on their food. And these people who didn't practice what we would call standard health practice today with rigid diets and stuff like that, they're making their food, they're having apple pie and preservatives, and they're making their own jellies and jams. And they lived great, robust, healthy lives, vibrant, physically active in their 80s and 90s, many of them living in their own homes and living a really high functional life with no knowledge of everything that we have today, just on traditional patterns. But those traditional patterns have been essentially sucked out of our food supply. And there's a benefit to that because as all of these proliferation of diseases happens, well, now we go to pharmaceutical integrations. Now keep in mind, both on the agriculture and the pharmaceutical side for people to know, these people are making a lot of money, and then that increases regulatory capture. And our elected officials being sponsored by them that push forward bills which are favorable to those organizations, but are unfavorable to the health of the citizens itself. And most of those political candidates have no idea either. So you have series of blindness contributing to the situation today. But the good news is here we are on the internet. Here we are, talking in 2 parts of the world, and we're putting the pieces together. And I see a renewed interest, particularly amongst the 20 and 30-year-olds right now, that is exciting. I go back to my hometown. I was talking to my mom last night, and she's like, I can't believe how many young people have moved back into the village. And they're all growing gardens and they're doing organics. And, their county fair that's been around for 150 years she said this year was the biggest attendance she's seen in her lifetime. All the people sharing their elements, which was a common element in rural communities, particularly. You'd go to the fair, everybody, my tomatoes grew great. Let me trade you. You had a good potato harvest, and they would exchange ideas. And for people who haven't been in the growing world, it's a really unique ecosystem of sharing information and ideas and what works and what happens and the natural ways to attack these challenges in our food supply. So I love these kind of conversations because I was gifted with what I thought was a limitation at the time, but gave me some insights. And of course, you still have a farm and you're dealing with that. So what do we do today, though? What do we do today? I'm a guy living in Los Angeles City. What do we do for those folks?
I mean, it is really tough because when you're living in that kind of environment, you have a lot denser exposure to all the kind of toxic load. So you have to be even more mindful of, how you take care of yourself. I mean, I'm not saying living on a farm, you don't have to be mindful of it either. But it's different. I mean, I'm out here on 300 acres. I can turn off my Wi-Fi and not be, assaulted at every angle. When I lived in Colorado, I have an app called Architecture of Radio, and you can turn it on and look around and you see all the Wi-Fi, all the 5G, all the satellite, like everything you're being bombarded with. And up here, there's hardly anything on there if I turn off my signal. And I think you have to build community. I mean, we have a lot of online community building now. I think since COVID, and a lot of these online tools have helped us, find people to connect with online. But like you're saying, these kids are going back into the community for real human connection. And I think that's the real piece of what we're starting to see a resurgence of a little bit, is trying to come back in real human connection, because these wedges were put between us during COVID, and you can't go out, and 6 feet apart and all this. And it's really in that real human connection where we share and learn, and we build an ecosystem together, which is basically what a good microbiome is, whether that's in the soil on your farm or in your gut. It is, bringing in this diversity and connecting and sharing and caring for each other. And I do see some of that in younger people, but I still think in our big cities, it's hard. It's really hard. And we used to have also, multi-generational households, and now, people take their old people and they stick them in a home and go visit them, once a month or once a week or whatever. And I think really getting back to that real human connection is going to be a huge piece of the puzzle for us to reconnect on multiple levels. And that also impacts our gut health, because the more we're in contact with diverse people, we share microbes, and that increases our diversity.
Yeah, and if you're living in the city, roll down to your local farmers market and start talking to the farmers. It's always an extraordinary education. Find out how they grow the food, where they get the food, what's their processes around the food. And once you start having a few of those conversations, you start to see there's this whole world that's it's exciting, and there's a natural inclination to find out about it and learn more, because there's something that resonates with, the spirit of life itself. There's an energizing principle that becomes aware. So I want to circle back. We touched on it. We haven't really got to it. So, and I want to be mindful of our time. What are some things that I think are best practices to reduce the endotoxin load inside a gut that could be leading to inflammatory conditions?
So best practices, eliminate processed foods.
Yep.
Eliminate a high sugar diet. Sugar, sucrose, fructose, that is feeding a pathogenic profile of the microbiome, both orally and in your gut. And those are your endotoxin producers. You want to support that gut lining. So you want to avoid the things that damage it. And, things that damage it are things like smoking. Actually, household cleaners or quaternary ammonium compounds, which are pretty much in any of the liquid soaps, anything that says antibacterial, your laundry detergents. You have to be very careful looking at your toothpaste. Any of that, that's some of the most damaging stuff to, this gut lining. You want to try to eat organic food or you want to talk to your farmer. And if they are using any kind of chemicals in their farming, you want to know when they use it, because sometimes they may use it at the very beginning of the process, but then they're not using chemicals throughout the harvest time. And so you can get a sense of, when your exposures might be, when you might be more at risk, but really looking at what you're putting in your body and what you're feeding, not only yourself, but your microbes, and your water. So water, I think, is really underappreciated. You used to be able to go out in a stream and drink the water. And I mean, there's no place in America that you would go drink the water out of a stream without some kind of treatment or filtration. But our public water systems, we're under the misconception, or most people are under the misconception, that we have safe water in the United States because they think, oh, I'm going to Mexico, I can't drink the water. Well, I'm going to tell you, you can't really drink the water in most places in the United States because our water systems were designed to treat bacteria.
That's right.
And what we have in our water systems now is a very toxic load of chemicals that have flow in through the wastewater systems, your neighbors' drugs that they're taking, that they're peeing down the drain, that many of those, come out, unchanged. So you have antibiotics flowing from animal husbandry into the waterways that comes into the public water systems, and on and on and on. Fluoride. So fluoride and aluminum. So they use aluminum for flocculants in the public water systems, and then they use fluoride, and those two together can form incredibly toxic compounds. So you want to be filtering your water, or buying water from somebody like El Dorado or Mountain Valley, or somebody who's got a nice, clean, mineral dense water source. But if you are filtering your water, you're also filtering out those minerals. And so back to our earlier discussion of, we are made of the earth, the trace minerals of the earth. And so if we're not getting a sufficient amount of earth, in a healthy way, then it's hard for the body to make the proper components. It'll use some backup systems, but they're not going to work as well.
All sound advice. Maybe before we go, you can maybe give a plug for your company, what you're doing, where they can find you, where they can kind of get into the details of best practice, maybe learning where they can find some of these tests, et cetera, to see where they're at, and then start implementing the mitigations from where they're at to kind of go to a better place in health. So the floor is yours.
So where you can find me. So I actually have a probiotics company called BioCollective, and we make working systems or teams that are for specific, so sugar metabolism or anxiety or those types of, very specific systems that we put back into the gut. And you can find that at biotiquest.com. That's BIOTIQUEST. And I have a Parkinson's blog, and that is Martha's Quest, where I write about specific gut-related diet, energy medicine, a lot of alternative things related to Parkinson's. And you can also see about the research I'm working on and the meetings, and I'm doing a documentary series in Parkinson's. So if you're interested there, I have a Substack also called Martha's Quest. And then if you want to kind of look at the history of the poop science and all of the things we did there, you could go to our website, which is thebiocollective.com, and it has kind of the whole timeline of the work we did there and the NIH grant that we did to make a reference material so that all of these tests could actually have a reference, when they're sequencing. But when I talk to people about gut health and where to look for solutions, there are a number of consumer kits out there. I do like Microbiome Labs. Partly I have a bias toward their test because they've used Cosmos ID, which was the sequencer that I worked with. So I was most familiar with that. I'm not sure that they're actually using the same sequencer now. There's a company from Europe that is about to come over here that was founded by a gentleman named Willem de Vos, and he's really one of the earliest pioneers in the microbiome space. So I'm interested to see that. Viome takes a totally different approach, and they provide nutritional information. There's a company called Day 2, and that was based on a large cohort looking at how different microbiomes and different people react to carbohydrates. And I think that it's a little bit harder to find because I think they go through doctors now. It used to be a consumer test, but that one's really interesting because some people can eat white bread and some people can't. And that's partly due to the kind of microbes you have and how they break down the carbohydrates and what they can do. That's a little bit trickier to find. There's one called Jonah Health. That's an interesting one. And I'm trying to, Tiny Health. So there's a new one out called Tiny Health that does whole genome sequencing. So there are a lot of kind of consumer-based resources where you can get a kit at home. And then, if you really want to dig into where you have a problem, I like the Genova Diagnostics. I think they actually have a different name now, and Doctors Data, because they are actually doing, they do some culturing. So you can really be certain that something is there through the culturing process. And they will actually give you, this organism is resistant to these antibiotics, or, these herbal remedies will be effective against it. And so I like tools like that. And when you're typically ordering a tool like that, you're working with a functional medicine practitioner or somebody who's been trained in those tools and knows how to use it. And, one of my favorite people in this space is Dr. Jill Carnahan. And I just heard her give a talk on the microbiome, and I was like, she knows it like I don't think I've seen very many MDs who really understand it as deeply as she does.
Well, Martha, this has been super informative, and for our listeners, we're going to put all the links in the show notes. And, if you're suffering from one of those conditions or know someone else, I encourage you to come on over to Martha's site and start following and get informed. Continuous exposure is an important aspect in the learning process. So you want to, if you were a little concerned about all the big names and everything, as you get down to it and understand it and expose it over time, you can pick it up just the same as any other type of language elements. You'll learn a lot, and it gives you tools when you are dealing with people, professionals and stuff. So you get a little extra care, a little bit of extra attention. They're like, oh, they're not just a standard run-of-the-mill person. They know some stuff. And that's a valuable resource. People have to remember, your doctor is not the authority. They're working for you as an expert in their given field. And just like you are deploying executives in a company, they're one of many executives. Some executives are great for you. Some executives aren't so great for you. So you can move through those things and take ownership and control of your health, because no doctor, no person, no one outside yourself will be intimately aware of what's going on in you or advocate for you. That's something that you have to own. So if there's anything I want to leave with, it's that. Be an advocate for your own health. Don't accept what I would call death sentences or sentences, well, we don't have anything for that, we don't have to do. That means that person just doesn't know what might be available. There's a plethora of things that are available, and you've been a wonderful resource to provide us so many different options to start doing your own investigation. So thank you for that, Martha. Appreciate that. And for our listeners today, hope you enjoyed this podcast. Again, all the show notes will be in the links. And we appreciate you joining us on this journey to awesome health. I'm Wade T. Lightheart from Bioptimizers. Thank you for listening to this podcast.
The Bioptimizer mission is to help more of the world fix their digestion at a core level. The truth is, your digestion is only as good as your enzyme levels. Imagine trying to build a house with a tree. It's impossible. You need to chop the tree down into small pieces. Similarly, in order for your food to be used by your body, it must be broken down into a bioavailable form. And that's what enzymes do, converting protein into amino acids, fats into specific fatty acids, and carbohydrates into usable energy units. We start out with an abundance of enzymes, and that's why kids can digest just about anything really quickly. The thing is cooking food kills enzymes as they cannot survive at temperatures above 118 degrees. So years of this ends up depleting our bodies and leads to weak digestion. Taking digestive enzymes like masszymes, which has an incredibly high level of protease for digesting protein, as well as other critical enzymes like lipase, amylase, and others is a total game changer. Suddenly you strengthen your digestion, eliminate gas and bloating, boost metabolism, and multiply your energy. Most importantly, you fix your digestion at a core level. To get started with masszymes and to save 10% on your first order, go to masszymes.com. That's masszymes.com and use the code MASS10, MASS10.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.